Okay, so this is part 3 of the sophomore lecture for April 1st. Sorry, I shouldn't keep saying that. Normally I'm only using one device and I just go from one to three. This is the third different recording device I'm using, trying to see which gives the best picture, which gives the best recording. So this is device 3, so we'll see if it goes any better. We'll start out by asking just a couple of questions. So the first one, Ms. Bittler, I'm also looking at Gus when I say Ms. Bittler. So I know you like to read lurid books, right? I saw you with H.P. Lovecraft. Don't deny it. Now, the thing I have is, what is the meaning again of the word lurid? We talked about it. You know, the lurid details of things like Penny Dreadful and the murder of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What does lurid mean? Yes, correct. It means unpleasantly colorful. Right in the basket. Okay, yes. So it means unpleasantly colorful, and it also often refers to kind of grotesque or sensational details, especially when about things like crime and sex. Okay. What we also should remember is, what is that word for not being really light, not being for really dark? It's an unnatural thing that's going on when Utterson is brought to Soho in the middle of the morning. Who will I ask? Let's see. Who might be a fan of vampire fiction who might remember the word? Now I'm just going to pick on Morris. Morris, what word am I looking for? No, Morris, I don't think you actually read vampire fiction. I'm just asking for the time of day. Yes, it is twilight, correct. Right? Yes, once again in. I'm 2 of 2, I'm on fire. Maybe it's this new recording device. I need to stick with it. Also, Gus is just a tad bit closer now. So, now that we're thinking about that, we're doing about that, the thing about these lurid cases, right? One of the things that we need to understand is that, as I said, Robert Louis Stevenson, right? He is engaging in this thing I call self-parody, just a little bit. And self-parody, right? He's making fun of himself. Like a parody is when you imitate something to make fun of it. But he's trying to understand that there's this culture right now of where people are beginning to love the idea of the penny dreadfuls. People are fascinated about the dark side, about tales of horrid things that go on in the inner city, right? I mean, it's true, right? Like, it was a time where women were exalted, but you could buy a 13-year-old girl for a shilling, as a famous English author said. One of the things that we need to understand is, in this self-parody, right, he's referring to the kind of progressive degeneration of London, and he's also talking about the idea of what might be causing this generation. You'll notice that it refers to, earlier this term, it refers to this morning glass. And in addition to referring to a morning glass, it talks about how Edward Hyde, in spite of being a degenerate and an animal and all these other nasty things, they all say that they seem to have some kind of deformity, but they can't agree on which one. One of the things it talks about is he just has this, this excellent wine closet, right? One of the more superficial interpretations of the symbolism of Jekyll and Hyde is going to be asking the question about what is the nature of being able to turn Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. Again, spoiler alert, I hate to ruin it for you, but if you didn't know, Dr. Jekyll, in an effort to try to separate parts of the person, supposedly he develops a formula that can separate the good side from himself from the evil side from himself, right? The idea that he somehow takes some kind of mixture and he becomes Edward Hyde. One of the things that we can understand is there is a combination of things that are mentioned, right? There's the mists of the twilight morning, the vapors being routed away, this mist. And there's also the mention of the morning glass, referring to early morning alcohol, and also referring to this idea of Edward Hyde. Of the only fine thing that he seems to have is wine. He does seem to have wine, and a lot of it. One of the things that has been asked, and you have to remember, especially in the context of this period where there's such a thing as teetotalers and a temperance movement that's going on, one of the ways in which literary critics interpret it is that the potion that turns Jekyll to Hyde, a lot of people think, is that the difference is actually alcohol. That is going to be what a lot of the literary critics are going to argue. Now, this is a very superficial, veneer level of interpretation. It's not something that goes very deep, but it's not an interpretation that's entirely without merit. if we think about it, there are all these kind of direct mentions to alcohol, but we also know that we see that there was alcohol when the cronies were getting together earlier too. So alcohol itself does not necessarily mean excessive drinking. However, one of the major aspects of crime back then is that a lot of the violent crime that would happen would often be associated with drinking, particularly murders associated with domestic violence. One of the reasons why this theme of how alcohol might be symbolic for the thing that actually transfers Jekyll into Hyde is the idea that if Hyde, right, is impulse, and if Hyde is a representation of the id, right, that kind of survival violent streak within the unconscious, the reason why alcohol is not an entirely bad interpretation of this potion that turns Jekyll to Hyde is because the thing that alcohol does, oftentimes, especially when it's affecting the frontal lobe, is the removal of impulse control. And this idea where it's the removal of impulse control, particularly when one of the major reasons behind the temperance movement, and by the way, the Prohibition Amendment would never have been passed without the massive amount of women who were supporting it. And the reason why that happened, granted this is the United States, not England, and it's later, but the reason why that happened is that the thing was believed that the primary cause of domestic violence and violence against women was drunkenness, particularly drunkenness resulting from the drinking of hard liquor. Now, granted, Hyde is not drinking hard. It doesn't say he has a bunch of hard liquor. It says he has wine. And we see that even Utterson drinks gin, but we also know that it says he drinks gin with restraint to mortify his taste for vintages, right? But this idea of liquor as being one of those things that takes away impulse control also reminds us of this phrase in Latin, in vino veritas, right? Which basically just means in wine truth. When people are drunk, they'll often say the truth that they would not normally say when their social sense would keep them from saying what they really think or what they really feel. The reason why this is an important idea is because so much of Victorian society and the facade of what is happening in this Victorian period is it's an era of outward respectability, but inward lust and inward depravity, right? There's a whole separation where it's not uncommon for rich people who want to sin but have no one know about it to change their appearance and to go down to Soho in order to sin and have a good time and have no one recognize them. By the way, the Pharisees in Jesus' time would often do the same things, change their appearance and go outside of Jerusalem to those places where they thought that no one would see or know about what they're doing. This is one of the reasons why John the Baptist calls them, you brood of vipers. They're not just letter of the law legalist hypocrites. They're also, hypocrites who think, okay, well, if it doesn't happen in Jerusalem, it doesn't count. Kind of like whatever happens in Vegas or whatever happens in Soho stays in Soho kind of thing. All of this idea about how this idea with drinking and impulse control, the degeneration of society, how the combination of fog and now smog is limiting the visibility in London, causing the degeneration. All of these things, whether it be alcohol, whether it be the fog, the smog, people going down to Soho to not be seen, the idea when it's talking about hues and colors and twilight and everything being weird and being in this dreamlike state, all of these things come together into this theme of reduced visibility, reduced control, right? Nothing in this society is transparent. Even though it's supposedly being divided very harshly in ideological standards between good and bad, the boundaries between good and evil are being mixed because of hypocrisy, and they're also being mixed because of the intentional muddying of the waters, or in this case, muddying of the skies, with the fact that everyone is wearing a disguise, everyone is wearing a mask. You even see in the very police officer, this is mentioned, when he hears about that Sir Danvers Carew who's been murdered, he's excited. And part of that is this whole Penny Dreadful excitement thing, like I'm part of something important. But what he also sees with the brutal murder of a well-known human being is the opportunity for advancement. right? We already see, even in this character of the police officer, this moral mixture, not of outrage, not of professionalism, but of he sees an opportunity to take advantage of. The only person who is maintaining themselves to be completely steady throughout the whole thing is Utterson. He pretty much knows it's probably going to be Sir Danvers Carew when they show him the envelope that has been given to him that was on Sir Danvers Carew's body. He could have told them immediately that it was Sir Danvers Carew who was probably murdered, but he doesn't. He says, no, I need to see the body first. And the reason why Utterson does this is because of professional propriety. If anyone else had been killed carrying this envelope, it would be in Utterson's duty to protect his client and to not reveal any information because it is his oath to maintain that confidentiality. Even when he thinks Carew is probably dead, he has to make sure, he has to follow the rules to the letter of the law before he can betray any confidences or give the police any information. Before Utterson does anything, he makes sure he protects his client first, right? We then see the opposite. So he's kind of like this stalwart person who's very much on the light side of the moral spectrum. But we see a lot more cloudiness, right, of some other people who are shown in the stage. When you see Mr. Hyde's innkeeper lady, right, and she's described, I believe, as slatternly. This is another term. This is kind of like the feminine way of calling someone slovenly. Basically, they look bad, they're unkempt in their appearance, they're ugly or filthy or disgusting, right? Slatternly, though, is usually only used to describe the feminine rather than slovenly, which can be used for both, but is also usually mostly to describe the masculine. This idea of her being disgusting, right? It also says that even though she's a disgusting person and she clearly, like, her face betrays evil, it also talks about how hypocrisy has smoothed her features, meaning she's capable of speaking politely and speaking courteously, even though you can sense the malice behind her expression. In this sense, we also see that she's joyful, right? This, again, this Penny Dreadful type of thing. When she hears it's like, oh, what has Hyde done? So unlike Utterson, she's eager to portray the confidences of her client. In that sense, we can see, okay, she's being portrayed as more evil, lacking confidence, but it's another way of kind of showing how everything is this weird, awful mix because she's willing to betray Mr. Hyde to the police, right? She's willing to help the police do their duty and betray her tenant, right? In this case, right, it's kind of showing how good and evil are being mixed up in a way that's highly unpleasant and very, very disturbing, right? That's kind of this idea of the mixing of what's going on. And the other reason why, again, we ask, is the potion of Jekyll and Hyde alcohol, is the idea that alcohol can be a fundamentally disorienting thing when used to excess, right? The idea that we're talking about, right, is that interestingly enough, at the beginning of the scene, we see a brutal murder, which is seen plain as day, right? Seen very, very clearly at night, right? At night, the evil is so visible to see. So there's this contrast between at night with the murder, the sky's clear, there's no fog, such wonderful visibility, so you can see the evil and all the horror. But now that we're at the light part of the day, the good part of the day, the part of the day where everything should be more clear and more apparent, everything is now murky and misty and mysterious, right? The idea is that evil is still being very clear, very plain as day, but it is goodness that is becoming mixed up in evil. It is goodness that is now obscured. It is goodness that is now difficult to see. This important, the clarity on the night of the murder, right, which overwhelms the senses, causes the maid to faint, versus the murkiness and the lack of detail of the mists and the visibility of the day when Utterson goes to identify Carew's body and the formal fugitive search for Mr. Hyde begins, right? So these are kind of the themes and how these things, different things work together. But in the meantime, Jesus loves you, so do I. This is the Danvers Carew murder case, and I'll see you soon.